My name is Elena Ward, and 12 years ago, I was forced to leave my teenage daughter behind after being framed for a crime I didn't commit. They told her I was a criminal who abandoned her. When I finally came home after clearing my name, I found her living as a maid in the house I had bought for her, serving the very people who had stolen everything from us. If you want to know how I fought to get my daughter back and expose the truth, stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more stories about families, betrayal, and justice. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud that seemed to echo through my entire body. 12 years. 12 years since I'd breathed the air of my homeland. 12 years since I'd seen my daughter's face in person rather than in fading photographs I carried across 3 continents. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest, and I forced myself to take slow, measured breaths. The airport lights blurred. Through tears I refused to let fall. Not yet. Not until I was holding Sarah again. I moved through customs in a daze, clutching my 2 battered suitcases and a leather folder that had become more precious to me than gold. Inside that folder were court documents, legal clearances, notarized statements, and evidence that proved my innocence. 12 years of my life condensed into paper and ink. 12 years of fighting a system that had been corrupted against me, of working under restrictive permits in foreign countries, of sending money home that I now wondered if Sarah ever received. 12 years of screaming into the void that I hadn't abandoned my daughter, that I'd been forced away, that I was coming back. And now I was here. The rental cars smelled like artificial pine and old cigarettes, but I barely noticed. My fingers fumbled with the GPS as I entered the address, the one I'd memorized like a prayer. The house I'd bought for Sarah before everything fell apart. $4 million of my life savings. A beautiful home in a gated neighborhood where I'd imagined her growing up safe and happy. Where I'd pictured Sunday morning breakfasts and late-night conversations when she came home from college. Where I'd dreamed of meeting her future husband, whoever he might be, and welcoming him into our family. I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The surprise on her face when she opened the door. The shock, the tears, the way she'd collapse into my arms the way she used to when she was small. I'd imagined explaining everything, showing her the documents that proved the medical fraud case was a lie, that I'd been framed by jealous colleagues and the very people who were supposed to love her. I'd practiced the words over and over. I never left you, sweetheart. I was fighting to come back every single day. The neighborhood appeared exactly as I remembered it, yet somehow different. The trees were taller, the paint on the houses slightly faded by time. I drove slowly through the pristine streets, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. And then there it was. The house. My house. Sarah's house. Something was wrong. The garden that I'd carefully designed before I left, the one with the rose bushes and the small fountain, looked unkempt. Not destroyed, but neglected. Weeds pushed through the decorative gravel. The paint on the shutters was peeling in places. There was no car in the driveway that I recognized as belonging to my daughter. The windows stared back at me like blank eyes, revealing nothing. I parked across the street, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. A cold sensation crept up my spine, the kind of instinctive warning that something fundamental was off. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I'd crossed oceans and fought legal battles and clawed my way through 12 years of hell to get here. Nothing was going to stop me from seeing my daughter. The front door was imposing, painted a deep burgundy I didn't remember choosing. I rang the doorbell and heard it chime somewhere deep inside the house. Footsteps approached, heavy and unhurried. The door swung open, and a woman I'd never seen before stood there, her face pinched with irritation. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with sharp features and cold eyes that swept over me dismissively. Her expensive silk blouse and pearl necklace spoke of wealth, but her expression spoke of cruelty. "Yes," she said, her tone making it clear I was an unwelcome interruption. "We don't need any services today." She started to close the door in my face. "Wait," I said, wedging my hand against the doorframe. My voice came out stronger than I felt. "I'm looking for Sarah. Sarah Ward. This is her house." The woman's eyes narrowed dangerously. We don't know any Sarah who lives here. The maid is inside, if that's who you're looking for. She practically spat the word maid, and something inside my chest cracked. Before I could respond, a figure appeared behind her in the dim hallway. A young woman carrying a basket of laundry, her posture bent with exhaustion. She wore a faded gray uniform that hung loosely on her thin frame, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was drawn, older than her years, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless work. And I knew her. God help me, despite the changes, despite the years and the pain etched into her features, I knew my own daughter. Sarah, I whispered, the name breaking on my lips. She looked up at the sound, her eyes meeting mine with no recognition whatsoever. Just polite confusion and a hint of fear, the way a servant might look at a stranger making demands at the door.
Mom?
Her voice was soft, uncertain. Do you need something? I'm not allowed to speak long. I have chores to finish. The older woman's hand shot out and gripped Sarah's shoulder possessively. Sarah, stop staring and get back to cleaning. The guest bathroom won't scrub itself. Sarah flinched at the harsh tone, her body automatically responding to the command. She started to turn away, and I saw it then, the way she moved. Like someone who expected punishment. Like someone who had forgotten she was worth more than orders and insults. Wait, I said again, louder this time. Both women turned to look at me. Sarah's eyes were wide, confused. The older woman's were filled with warning. And that's when Sarah said it. That's when my world tilted completely off its axis. I'm sorry, Mother, she said to the older woman. I'll get back to work right away. Mother. My daughter had just called another woman mother. The older woman, this stranger who stood in the doorway of the house I bought, placed her hand on my daughter's shoulder like she owned her. Like Sarah was a possession, a thing to be controlled and commanded. And Sarah accepted it. She didn't question it. She'd been trained to accept it. I don't remember stepping back from the door. I don't remember the older woman saying something sharp and dismissive before slamming it in my face. All I could hear was the roaring in my ears, the sound of my heart breaking in real time. All I could see was my daughter, my brilliant, beautiful daughter who'd once dreamed of becoming an architect, wearing a maid's uniform in her own home, calling another woman mother. They'd done this. Daniel's family. The same people who'd helped frame me 12 years ago, who'd worked with that jealous colleague to destroy my career and force me out of the country. They'd taken my absence and weaponized it. They'd turned my daughter into their servant while living in the house I'd bought with my life savings. I stood on that pristine suburban sidewalk, the afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders, and felt something inside me transform. The grief and shock began to crystallize into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. I walked back to my rental car with steady steps. I got inside, closed the door, and pulled out my phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My vision was crystal clear. I dialed the number I'd memorized years ago, the attorney who'd helped me navigate the legal nightmare abroad. He answered on the second ring. Marcus, I said, my voice cold and controlled. I need you to prepare everything. File every motion, gather every document, call in every favor we have. I'm taking my daughter back, and I'm destroying the people who did this to her.
Elena.
His voice was concerned. What happened? I thought you were just planning to surprise Sarah and explain everything. Plans changed, I said, staring at the burgundy door that had been slammed in my face. These people have been living in my daughter's house, using her as their maid, and feeding her lies for 12 years. They think they've won. They think I'm still that terrified woman they chased out of the country. I took a breath, and when I spoke again, my voice was steel. They have no idea what's coming for them. That first night back was the longest of my life, and I'd had plenty of long nights to compare it to. I'd rented a small, furnished apartment on the edge of town, the kind of anonymous space where no one asks questions and the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbors' arguments. I sat on the scratchy sofa with all the lights off, watching the city glow through the window, and let the memories I'd been holding back for 12 years finally crash over me. The arrest. That terrible morning when 6 officers had shown up at my hospital with a warrant and accusations I couldn't comprehend. Medical fraud. Trafficking restricted surgical equipment. My signature on documents I'd never seen. Authorizing deals I'd never made. The shocked faces of my colleagues as I was let out in handcuffs. The flash of cameras. The news crews that materialized like vultures sensing blood. I remembered the interrogation room. The cold metal chair. The detective who'd looked at me with such contempt. I remembered how the evidence had seemed so airtight, so perfectly constructed. Bills of sale with my signature. Emails from my account. Bank transfers I couldn't explain. It had all been fake, but it had been done so skillfully that even I had moments of doubt in those early days, wondering if I'd somehow been sleepwalking through crimes I didn't remember committing. And then had come the choice. The terrible, impossible choice. Go to trial and risk life imprisonment, or accept the International Protection Clause, leave the country immediately, and fight the case from abroad while the investigation continued. They told me it would take 6 months, maybe a year at most. It became 12. I'd left thinking I was protecting Sarah, keeping her from seeing her mother dragged through a criminal trial. I'd left thinking I'd be back before she even really understood what had happened. I'd had no idea that the moment I was gone, vultures would descend on my wounded child. Now, sitting in this dark apartment, I pulled out my laptop and started researching. I needed to understand what had happened in those 12 years. I needed to know who these people were who'd taken over Sarah's life. Daniel Harper. That was the husband's name, according to the public records I pulled up. He'd married Sarah 3 years after I left. She would have been only 20 years old, still grieving, still vulnerable. His family ran a medical supply business, the same industry where I'd worked. The same industry where I'd been framed. The connection started becoming clearer, and with each new piece of information, my rage grew colder and more focused. The next morning, I went to see the neighbors. Not the house next door. That would be too obvious and probably too compromised. But I remembered an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who'd lived 3 houses down and had always been kind. I hoped they still lived there. I hoped they remembered me. Mrs. Henderson answered the door, her face older and more lined, but her eyes still sharp. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact second recognition dawned. "Dear God," she whispered.
Elena.
"Hello, Mrs. Henderson," I said, and my voice nearly broke. "I'm back." She pulled me inside quickly, glancing up and down the street as if checking for observers. Her living room smelled like lavender and old books, exactly as I remembered. She made me sit, made me tea I didn't drink, and then she told me everything. "They moved in right after your scandal," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "Daniel's family. They came with lawyers and documents, saying you'd sign the house over to them before you left. Said you'd abandoned Sarah, and they were stepping in to care for her." "I never signed anything," I said through gritted teeth. "I was forced to leave, Mrs. Henderson. I was framed, and I never abandoned my daughter." "I believe you," she said quietly. "I always thought something was wrong about the whole thing. You weren't that kind of person. But what could I do? They had lawyers. They had papers. And Sarah, poor child. She was so lost after you left. She kept asking when you were coming back, and then gradually she just stopped asking. They broke something in her, Elena. We all saw it happening, but we didn't know how to help." The teacup rattled in my shaking hands. "Tell me everything. Please."
She did.
She told me how Sarah had tried to resist at first, insisting the house was hers, that her mother would come back and fix everything. How Daniel's family had been patient at first, playing the role of caring in-laws, slowly introducing the idea that I'd committed crimes and fled to avoid prosecution. How they'd isolated Sarah from her friends, her college plans, her entire support system. "They told her you were a criminal," Mrs. Henderson said, tears in her eyes. "They told her you'd chosen your freedom over your daughter." And eventually, Sarah started to believe it. What choice did she have? She was alone, and they were there, and they had all these documents and news articles to prove their story. "And the house?" I asked. "How did they get legal control?" Mrs. Henderson stood up and disappeared into another room. She came back carrying a cardboard box, worn at the edges and covered in dust. "These are yours," she said, setting it on the coffee table between us. They were marked, "Return to sender," and left in a pile by the mailbox. I collected them over the years. I kept thinking maybe someday you'd come back and need them. I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were letters. Dozens of letters. All in my handwriting, addressed to Sarah at this house. Every single one marked, "Return to sender," or "Addressee unknown." Letters I'd sent from 3 different countries, pouring out my heart, explaining what had happened, begging Sarah to believe that I hadn't left her. Sarah had never received a single one. I picked up an envelope dated 8 years ago, my birthday greeting to Sarah on her 18th birthday. I'd sent it with a check, hoping she could use it for college. The envelope had been opened, the check removed, and then the letter resealed and returned. They'd stolen even that small comfort from her. "They took everything," I whispered. "Every attempt I made to reach her, they intercepted." Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. "We suspected, but we couldn't prove it. The postman was new, didn't know the history, and they controlled all access to Sarah. She wasn't allowed to check the mail herself." I spent the rest of the morning with Mrs. Henderson, taking notes, documenting everything she could remember. Then I went to see Marcus, my attorney, with all my new information. His office was downtown in one of those old buildings with creaking elevators and frosted glass doors. Marcus looked older too, grayer, but his eyes were still sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to everything, making notes, occasionally shaking his head in disgust. "The signature on the deed transfer," he said finally, pulling up documents on his computer. "I need you to look at this." He turned the screen toward me. There was my name, Elena Ward, signed on a power of attorney document that supposedly granted Daniel's family rights over the house. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but when I looked closer, I could see the differences. The way the E curved slightly wrong. The angle of the W. It was a good forgery, but it was still a forgery. "That's not my signature," I said flatly. "They faked it." "I believe you," Marcus said. "But proving it is going to take time. We'll need a handwriting expert, document analysis, the works. And even then, it's going to be your word against theirs, and they've had 12 years to build their story." "I don't care how long it takes," I said. "I'm not leaving again. I'm not abandoning Sarah again, even if she doesn't remember me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Elena, you need to understand something. This isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. This is about deprogramming a young woman who's spent 12 years being psychologically abused. Sarah doesn't just think you abandoned her. She's been trained to believe it. She's been trained to accept abuse as normal. This is going to be complicated and painful." "I know," I said. "That's why I need your help. We're going to do this right. We're going to build an airtight case. And we're going to make sure Daniel's family pays for every single thing they've done." He nodded slowly. "All right. Then we start with documentation. I need you to watch that house without being seen. Document everything. How they treat her, what they make her do, any evidence of abuse or coercion. We'll also need to pull records on that deed transfer, find out exactly how they managed to get it through the system." "They had help," I said. "They had to. This whole thing was too coordinated, too perfect." "Agreed," Marcus said. "Which means we're not just fighting the Harper family. We're fighting whoever helped them 12 years ago. Elena, are you ready for this? Because once we start pulling these threads, dangerous people are going to realize you're back." I thought of Sarah, my beautiful daughter who used to dance through our old house singing off-key, who'd once told me she wanted to design buildings that made people happy. I thought of her flinching when that woman barked orders at her. I thought of her calling a stranger mother. "Let them realize it," I said. "I spent 12 years running, fighting from a distance, trying to clear my name through proper channels. That time is over. Now I'm here, and I'm not backing down until my daughter is free." Marcus smiled grimly. "All right then. Let's go to war." That afternoon, I bought a camera with a telephoto lens and parked down the street from the house. From this angle, I could see the back garden and the side entrance. I watched for hours, documenting everything. I saw Sarah come out to hang laundry, her movements efficient but joyless. I saw Daniel's mother follow her outside and inspect her work, saying something that made Sarah's shoulders hunch defensively. I watched my daughter live like a prisoner in her own home, and with each passing minute, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. That night, alone in my apartment, I let myself break down. I cried for the years I'd lost. I cried for the childhood stolen from Sarah. I cried for the mother-daughter relationship that had been poisoned by lies. I cried until I had nothing left, and then I got up, washed my face, and started planning. Because crying wouldn't save Sarah. Evidence would. Strategy would. Cold, calculated justice would. I made a promise to my daughter's photograph, the one I'd carried across 3 continents. I never left you, sweetheart. And I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove it to everyone, especially to you. And then I'm going to make sure the people who did this to us pay for every single day they stole from our lives. The war had begun, and I was done fighting fair. I spent the next week watching my daughter's life from a distance, documenting her daily prison, and learning the full extent of how completely they'd broken her spirit. Every morning, I parked down the street at 4:45 a.m., armed with coffee I never drank and a notebook that filled with increasingly horrific details. Sarah's day began at 4 a.m. I knew this because I saw the lights in what must be her room flick on at exactly that time, every single day. By 4:30, she was in the kitchen. I could see her shadow moving behind the curtains, preparing breakfast for a household that treated her like an appliance. On the 3rd morning of my surveillance, I positioned myself at a different angle and used the telephoto lens to capture her through the kitchen window. The photos I took that morning made Marcus swear when I showed them to him later. Sarah moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her face blank with exhaustion, preparing an elaborate spread. Fresh pastries, eggs cooked 3 different ways, fruit perfectly arranged, coffee in an expensive silver service. At 6 a.m., the family began appearing. Daniel first, in his business suit, grabbing food without acknowledging Sarah's existence. Then his mother, the woman who'd slammed the door in my face, inspecting everything with a critical eye. His younger sister next, complaining about the temperature of her coffee. And finally, his father, a heavy-set man who ate in silence while reading his tablet. Not once did any of them thank Sarah. Not once did they speak to her as a person. She was furniture that happened to cook and clean. I watched Daniel bark at her when his eggs weren't perfect, saw her apologize profusely and remake them while he stood over her, criticizing every movement. I watched his mother, accidentally, knock a glass of orange juice onto the floor and then command Sarah to clean it up immediately, despite Sarah being in the middle of serving breakfast. The entire family stepped over the spilled juice and Sarah on her hands and knees, continuing their conversation about their golf plans for the weekend. After breakfast, Sarah cleaned the kitchen while the family dispersed to their various activities. None of them had jobs they needed to leave for, I realized. They were living off the house, off whatever money they'd stolen or manipulated. Living like parasites on my daughter's inheritance. By 8 a.m., Sarah was moving through the house with cleaning supplies. I documented everything. The way she scrubbed bathrooms, vacuumed carpets, dusted furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. She worked without breaks, without music, without any of the small comforts that make housework bearable. On the 4th day, I witnessed something that made me nearly abandon my plan to stay hidden. Daniel's sister, a woman named Melissa who looked like a younger version of their mother, called Sarah into the living room. I watched through the window as Melissa deliberately spilled an entire bottle of nail polish on the white carpet, then screamed at Sarah for not having protected the floor properly. Sarah dropped to her knees immediately, scrubbing at the stain with tears streaming down her face, while Melissa stood over her listing all the ways Sarah was worthless and incompetent. I had my hand on the car door handle, ready to storm in there, when Sarah did something that stopped me cold. She apologized. She apologized for not anticipating that Melissa might spill something. She apologized for the quality of her cleaning. She apologized for existing in a way that inconvenienced this family. She'd been so thoroughly broken that she believed she deserved this treatment. I sat back in my car, shaking with rage, and forced myself to take photos instead of breaking down doors. This evidence would matter. This evidence would be what freed her. That afternoon, I learned about Daniel. He came home early, around 2 p.m., and I watched the dynamic between him and Sarah shift in a different, equally disturbing direction. Where his family was overtly cruel, Daniel was insidiously manipulative. He called Sarah into his study, and though I couldn't hear the conversation, I could see it through the window. He sat in a leather chair like a king on a throne while Sarah stood before him, hands clasped, head bowed. He talked for what seemed like hours while she nodded, flinching occasionally at whatever he was saying. When she finally left the study, her face was even paler than usual. She went straight to the side door, the servants' entrance, and sat down on the steps outside. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. I wanted to go to her so badly, it physically hurt. But not yet. Not yet. That evening, I saw more of Daniel's particular brand of cruelty. At dinner, which Sarah served but was not allowed to eat at the table, Daniel called her back repeatedly. The food was too cold. No, now it was too hot. The presentation wasn't right. She'd used the wrong plates. Each criticism was delivered in a calm, reasonable voice that somehow made it worse than shouting. He was training her to believe that nothing she did would ever be good enough. After dinner, while the family retired to the media room to watch something on their massive television, Sarah cleaned the dining room. I watched her carefully wash each dish, dry it, put it away. Her movements were mechanical, perfected through years of repetition and fear of punishment. And then, when she thought she was alone, she did something that broke my heart and gave me hope in equal measure. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, one she'd apparently hidden somewhere in the kitchen. She sat at the table where she'd just served a family who treated her like dirt, and she began to sketch. Even from my distant vantage point, even through the camera lens, I could see the passion in her movements. Her hand moved quickly, confidently, creating something on that page. For those few stolen minutes, Sarah wasn't a maid. She was an architect, creating buildings that existed only in her imagination, keeping alive the dream they'd tried to kill. Then she heard footsteps, and the transformation was instant. The notebook disappeared back into her pocket, and Sarah was scrubbing the already clean table when Melissa walked in demanding a snack. I cried in my car that night, overwhelmed by the evidence of my daughter's suffering and the tiny spark of her old self that had somehow survived.
She was still in there.
The girl who'd once spread architectural drawings across our old kitchen table, who'd talked excitedly about buildings that could make people feel joy, she was still in there somewhere. I just had to help her remember. The next day, I took a risk. I bought a warm jacket, one I knew Sarah would need because I'd seen her shivering on those cold morning trips to hang laundry. I bought the sketchbook I'd seen her using, but a nicer one with better paper. And I wrote a note. From someone who still loves you. I waited until the family was out. I'd been tracking their schedules and slipped it inside the side door, the servants' entrance my daughter was forced to use. Then I returned to my surveillance position and waited. 2 hours later, Sarah came to the door with trash bags. She saw the package, looked around confused, then brought it inside. Through the window, I watched her open it. I watched her face transform with confusion, then something that looked almost like hope. She held the jacket close, touched the soft fabric of the sketchbook, read the note over and over. And then Daniel's mother came into the kitchen. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw her rip the note from Sarah's hands, saw her face twist with fury. She said something harsh, and Sarah's expression crumbled. She tried to keep the jacket, but the older woman snatched it away. The sketchbook, too. But Sarah didn't let go. For the first time in all my days of watching, Sarah held on to something. She clutched that sketchbook and shook her head. Daniel's mother raised her hand as if to slap her, and Sarah flinched, but didn't release the book. Finally, the older woman stormed off with just the jacket and the note, leaving Sarah standing there trembling, clutching the sketchbook like a lifeline. That night, I watched Sarah's window. The light stayed on until almost midnight. She was drawing. She was keeping that small part of herself alive despite everything they'd done to kill it. Over the next several days, I continued documenting while also leaving small signs for Sarah. A pressed flower, the kind she used to love collecting when she was small. A bookmark with an inspiring quote about never giving up on dreams. Small things she could hide, small reminders that someone out there cared about her. And slowly, I began to see changes. Subtle ones, but they were there. Sarah started standing a little straighter. When Melissa yelled at her, she still apologized, but I noticed a flicker in her eyes, something that looked like doubt. When Daniel gave his manipulative lectures, she nodded, but her jaw was set differently. The seed was planted. Now I just needed to water it carefully, patiently, until it grew strong enough to break through the concrete that had been poured over my daughter's spirit. On the 10th day of my surveillance, something happened that accelerated my timeline. I watched Daniel corner Sarah in the hallway, saw him grab her wrist hard enough to leave marks. He was yelling about something, his face red with anger. Sarah tried to pull away, and he shoved her against the wall. I had my phone out and Marcus on speed dial before I even realized I was doing it. "I need that protective order filed," I said when he answered.
Today. Right now.
I just watched her husband assault her. "Did you get it on video?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp and professional. "Every second," I said, watching through my camera as Sarah slid down the wall, crying. "Marcus, I can't wait anymore. We have enough evidence. It's time." "All right," he said. "Come to my office. We're filing everything today. And Elena? Once we do this, there's no going back. They're going to know you're here, and they're going to fight." I watched Daniel walk away from Sarah without helping her up, without apologizing, leaving her crumpled on the floor of her own home. "Good," I said. "I'm ready to fight back." Marcus worked late into that night, and so did I. We organized every piece of evidence into a comprehensive file that painted a devastating picture of the Harper family's fraud and abuse. The forged deed transfer, the intercepted mail, the photographs of Sarah's daily servitude, the video of Daniel's assault. Financial records Marcus had subpoenaed showing that the Harpers had been siphoning money from accounts tied to the house. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus's investigator found something in the public records that changed everything. "The notary seal on the deed transfer," Marcus said, pointing at his computer screen. "It's from a notary public named Gerald Stevens. Want to know something interesting? Gerald Stevens died 7 months before this document was supposedly notarized." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "They used a dead man's seal?" "Not just any dead man," Marcus said grimly. "A notary who worked for the same medical supply company as Daniel's family. This is smoking gun territory, Elena. This document isn't just a forgery. It's criminal fraud using official seals. That's a federal offense." For the first time in 12 years, I felt something close to hope. Real, solid hope backed by legal weight. "File everything," I said. "Tomorrow morning. I want them to wake up to a nightmare they never saw coming." But I wasn't done with my own preparations. That night, I drove to a cafe about 3 blocks from Sarah's house. It was called the Morning Bloom, a small place with good coffee and big windows. It was the kind of place where someone could sit for hours without being bothered, watching the street, waiting. I went inside and talked to the owner, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Diane. I told her I was looking for work, anything to keep me busy while I settled back into town. She looked at my resume, what little I could show her without revealing my medical background, and hired me on the spot to work the morning shift. "Can you start tomorrow?" she asked. "Perfect," I said, looking out the window at the street Sarah would walk down if she ever got to leave the house for errands. The next morning, I was behind the counter of the Morning Bloom at 5 a.m., making coffee and preparing pastries, watching the street like a hawk. Marcus filed our initial paperwork at 9 a.m. sharp. By 9:30, a courier had delivered it to the Harper household. I couldn't see their reactions, but I imagined them. The shock, the panic, the sudden realization that the woman they'd chased away 12 years ago was back and armed with evidence. What I didn't expect was Sarah. Around 11 a.m., the cafe door opened and she walked in. She looked terrible, exhausted, stressed, moving with the hurried steps of someone who knew they'd be punished if they took too long. She approached the counter with her eyes down, clutching a list in her hand. 6 coffees, she said quietly. 2 lattes, 1 cappuccino, 3 black coffees. And whatever pastries you have. They need to be perfect. Her voice was so small, so defeated. And she still hadn't looked at my face. Of course, I said, keeping my voice gentle. That's a big order. Special occasion. No, she said, finally glancing up. Just regular, I suppose. There are lawyers at the house. Everyone's upset about something. Our eyes met, and I saw it happen. The flicker of recognition, confusion, a strange pull she couldn't identify. She'd seen my face before at her door, but her mind couldn't quite put the pieces together. Years of gaslighting had made her doubt her own perceptions. You have your mother's eyes, I said softly. Sarah's hand flew to her chest, and she stepped back like I'd struck her. How would you know that? Her voice was barely a whisper. Just an observation, I said, beginning to prepare her order. They're beautiful, expressive, the kind of eyes that belong to someone with dreams. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. When was the last time anyone had complimented her? When was the last time anyone had suggested she was capable of having dreams? I don't, she stammered. I need the coffee. Please. I made her order carefully, and as I packaged it up, I made sure our hands touched when I passed her the carrier. Just for a second. Just enough. She pulled back like she'd been burned, but not in a bad way. In a way that suggested something dormant had just stirred awake. Thank you, she whispered and hurried out. I watched her walk back toward the house, and I saw her pause once, turn, and look back at the cafe. At me. Then she shook her head as if clearing it, and continued on. That afternoon, Marcus called me.
They responded, he said.
And Elena, they're terrified. Their lawyer is already trying to make this go away quietly. They're offering settlements, trying to negotiate. No settlements, I said firmly. We're going to trial. We're going public. I want everyone to know what they did. They're also doing something else, Marcus said, his voice concerned. My sources say they're planning to move Sarah. Send her to Daniel's brother's house in another state. They're calling it protecting her from distressing legal matters. My blood ran cold. They're going to kidnap her. Essentially, yes. They're panicking, and people do desperate things when they panic. Elena, we need to accelerate our timeline. That protective order I filed? It might not be enough. Then what do? We bring Sarah the truth directly, Marcus said. We can't wait for the legal system to work its magic. We need to break through their control now, before they can move her. That evening, as the sun set, I put together a package. Inside was the childhood photo Mrs. Henderson had kept for me, one of Sarah and me together at her 10th birthday party. Sarah was laughing, her face covered in cake, and I was hugging her from behind, both of us grinning at the camera. We looked so happy. We'd been so happy. I included a note. She never abandoned you. They stole 12 years from both of us. I'm coming for you, sweetheart. Your real mother is coming. I waited until after midnight, then slipped it through the side door, the servant's entrance. The entrance my daughter should never have been forced to use. The next morning, from my position at the cafe, I watched the house. I saw the chaos. Saw Daniel's mother storming around, visible through the windows. Saw Daniel on his phone, pacing and gesturing angrily. And then I saw Sarah. She came out the side door, holding the photograph. She stood in the garden, staring at it, her hand trembling. Daniel's mother appeared behind her, tried to snatch it away. And for the first time in all my weeks of watching, Sarah said no. I couldn't hear her from this distance, but I saw her lips form the word.
Saw her clutch the photo to her chest.
Saw Daniel's mother raise her hand to slap her. And Sarah caught her wrist. The older woman staggered back, shocked. Sarah stood her ground, shaking but defiant, holding onto that photograph like it was the only true thing in her world. Daniel came out then, grabbed Sarah's arm roughly. She pulled away, and he grabbed harder. Sarah cried out, Loud enough that I heard it from 3 blocks away. Loud enough that neighbors started opening their doors. I was already running. By the time I reached the house, a small crowd had gathered. Daniel was trying to drag Sarah toward a car parked in the driveway. Sarah was fighting him, really fighting him, screaming that she wouldn't go. His mother was shrieking about ungrateful children and police and mental instability. "Stop," I shouted, my voice carrying over all of them. Daniel turned, still gripping Sarah's arm. "Stay out of this, lady. This is family business." "Family business?" I walked forward, and something in my expression made him take a step back. "That's interesting, Daniel Harper. Because that woman you're assaulting? That's my daughter. And this house you're all squatting in? I bought it with my life savings. And those documents you used to steal it? I can prove they're forgeries." Sarah's eyes went wide. She looked between us, her mouth opening and closing, trying to process. "You're lying," Daniel spat. "You're that woman who tried to cause trouble before. We'll call the police." "Please do," I said calmly. I pulled out my phone and held up the screen, showing him the court documents Marcus had sent me. "I'd love for them to see the federal fraud charges you're about to face. Using a dead man's notary seal? That's creative. Stupid, but creative." Daniel's face went pale. His mother pushed forward, her face twisted with rage. "She's a criminal. She abandoned Sarah. Is that what you told her?" I turned to Sarah, speaking directly to my daughter for the first time in 12 years. "Is that what they told you, sweetheart? That I left you?" Sarah was crying now, confused and overwhelmed. "I don't understand."
Who are you?
Why do you look? "Because I'm your mother," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "My name is Dr. Elena Ward. 12 years ago, I was framed for medical fraud by people connected to this family. I was forced to leave the country to avoid false imprisonment. I spent 12 years fighting to clear my name and come back to you. And every single letter I sent, every call I tried to make, they intercepted it all. They made you think I abandoned you, but I never did, Sarah. I never stopped fighting to come home." I held out the photograph she was clutching. "Do you remember that birthday?
You were 10.
You wanted a chocolate cake with purple frosting because purple was your favorite color. You told me you wanted to design buildings when you grew up. Buildings that made people happy." Sarah stared at the photo, then at me, then back at the photo. Her breathing was coming in short gasps. "The woman in my dreams," she whispered. "The one who sang to me, who braided my hair. I thought I made her up." "You didn't make her up," I said, taking a careful step closer. "She's real. I'm real. And I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." Daniel tried to pull Sarah back, but she jerked her arm free so violently he stumbled. She moved toward me, hesitant, like a wild animal approaching food, unsure if it's a trap. "They said you were bad," she whispered. "They said you chose crime over me. They said you never loved me." "They lied," I said simply. "About everything. And I can prove it. I have documents, evidence, witnesses." "But Sarah, even if I didn't have any of that, all you need to do is ask yourself one question. Does what they told you feel true? Or does it feel like something they needed you to believe?" She was close enough now that I could see the tears streaming down her face, could see the war happening behind her eyes. Years of gaslighting and abuse fighting against instinct and buried memories. "I don't know what's real anymore," she sobbed. "Then let me show you," I said. "Let me prove who I am. Let me prove that I never left you, that I've been fighting to come back every single day for 12 years. Give me one chance, Sarah. Just one." Behind her, Daniel was on his phone, probably calling a lawyer. His mother was screaming something about restraining orders and police and defamation. The neighbors were recording everything on their phones. But Sarah only had eyes for me. And slowly, trembling, she held out her hand. I took it, and the moment our fingers touched, something broke in her. A dam that had been holding back 12 years of grief and doubt and pain. She collapsed forward, and I caught her, holding my daughter for the first time since she was 16 years old. "I knew you," she whispered into my shoulder. "Somewhere deep down, I knew you wouldn't leave me. I knew. I didn't leave you," I whispered back, clutching her tight. They stole you from me, but I'm taking you back now. I'm taking you home. Police sirens approached, and I knew the next few hours would be complicated. But my lawyer was on speed dial, our evidence was solid, and most importantly, my daughter was in my arms instead of theirs. The war wasn't over. But we'd won our first battle, and it was the one that mattered most. Sarah had chosen me. After 12 years of lies, she'd chosen truth. She'd chosen her real mother. And now they would learn what it meant to have taken a mother's daughter. Now they would face the consequences of 12 years of fraud, abuse, and theft. Now the real fight would begin, and this time, I had something more powerful than lawyers and evidence. I had my daughter back, and together, we were unstoppable. The police arrived within minutes, but Marcus was faster. He'd been waiting 3 blocks away, ready for exactly this moment. By the time the officers stepped out of their patrol car, my lawyer was already presenting documentation, protective order filings, and enough legal ammunition to make it clear that the Harper family had far more to answer for than I did. Sarah stayed pressed against me the entire time, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Every time Daniel or his mother tried to approach, she flinched deeper into my arms. That reaction alone told the officers everything they needed to know about the dynamics at play. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to me gently, "we're going to need statements from everyone. Can you and your daughter come down to the station?" "Gladly," I said. "But I want it on record that my daughter is coming with me voluntarily, and that the Harper family has no legal authority over her or this property." Daniel's mother started shrieking again, but the officer held up his hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. If you have legal documents proving ownership or guardianship, you can present them at the station." "We have documents," she spat. "We have a deed transfer signed by her." Marcus stepped forward smoothly, holding up his tablet. Documents that were notarized by a man who died 7 months before the alleged notarization date. "Federal fraud, officer. We filed charges this morning." The officer's expression shifted from neutral to interested. "Is that so? Then I think you folks better come down to the station separately. We're going to need to sort this out properly." That night at the police station was long but necessary. Sarah sat beside me in the interview room, still holding my hand like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. She gave her statement haltingly, describing years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and servitude. The detective taking her statement had to pause twice, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. When they finally released us around midnight, Marcus drove us to my small apartment. Sarah looked around the sparse space, so different from the mansion she'd been living in, and something in her face softened. "It's quiet here," she whispered. "No one yelling. No one will yell at you ever again. I promised. Not while I'm breathing." We stayed up until dawn. I showed her everything. The court documents proving my innocence, the letters I'd sent that had been returned, photographs from her childhood, videos I'd saved on an old hard drive. Years of evidence that I'd never stopped being her mother, never stopped fighting to come home. Sarah cried through most of it, touching each photograph like it was sacred, watching videos of herself as a child with wonder and grief mixed together. "I remember this," she said, pointing at a video of her 5th birthday. "I remember the purple dress. I remember your voice singing happy birthday. But they told me I was making it up. They said my memories were fantasies, that you were never the person I thought you were." "They lied," I said firmly. "Everything they told you was designed to break you down, to make you believe you deserved how they treated you. But Sarah, you never deserved any of it. You were a child who lost her mother through no fault of your own. And they exploited that grief for their own benefit." Over the next few days, Sarah began the painful process of reclaiming herself. It started small. The first morning in my apartment, she woke up at 4 a.m. out of habit, ready to start cooking and cleaning. I found her in the kitchen, panicking because there was no food prepared. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "you don't have to cook for anyone. This is your home now. You can sleep in, eat when you're hungry, do whatever you want." She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "But the family, they need breakfast by 6, And if it's not perfect, Mother gets angry, and Daniel says I'm useless if I can't even manage basic tasks, and… Sarah. I took her hands. That family has no power over you anymore. You're not their maid. You never were. You're my daughter. And in this house, the only expectation is that you heal. It took 3 days before she stopped asking permission to use the bathroom. A week before she ate a meal sitting down instead of standing by the sink. 2 weeks before she slept past 6 a.m. But the real breakthrough came when I set up the drafting table. I'd ordered it online, along with professional-grade supplies. Pencils, rulers, templates, paper. When it arrived, I assembled it in the corner of the living room where the light was best. Sarah watched me with confusion and something that looked like fear. "What is that for?" she asked quietly. "For you," I said. "You used to want to be an architect. I thought maybe you still did." Her face crumpled. I haven't, it's been so long. I'm not good enough. I never was. Daniel said it was a stupid dream, and his mother said I should be grateful to clean houses instead of pretending I could design them. Sarah. I walked over and took her face in my hands. Daniel is a liar and an abuser. His mother is a thief and a manipulator. And their opinions about your worth are as worthless as the forged documents they used to steal from us. Now, I'm not saying you have to use this table, but it's here if you want it. Your dreams are here if you want them. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and found Sarah sitting at the drafting table, sketching by lamplight. Tears were streaming down her face, but her hand moved with confidence across the paper, creating the outline of a building that seemed to reach toward the sky. I didn't interrupt. I just watched my daughter rediscover the person the Harper family had tried to kill. Meanwhile, Marcus was building our legal case into something devastating. The detective who'd taken Sarah's statement had connected us with other officials, and suddenly the fraud case was expanding beyond what we'd initially imagined. The Harper family's medical supply business, Marcus told me over the phone. "It's dirty, Elena. Really dirty. Your colleague, who helped frame you? He was taking kickbacks from them. They were selling substandard equipment to hospitals, and you were getting close to discovering it 12 years ago. That's why they destroyed you." Everything clicked into place. I'd been about to report irregularities in surgical equipment right before the arrest. I'd noticed patterns, devices failing more than they should, outcomes that didn't match the specifications. I'd been building a case to present to the board. They'd struck first, turning my investigation into evidence against me. "They didn't just steal my daughter," I said slowly. "They stole my career, my reputation, 12 years of my life, all to cover up their own crimes. And now we're going to make them pay for every bit of it," Marcus said grimly. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you tomorrow. This is going to be big, Elena." That night, I sat Sarah down and explained what was coming. The trial, the publicity, the fact that her marriage to Daniel would need to be legally dissolved and investigated for coercion. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I have to see them again? What if they convince people I'm lying? What if?" "Then I'll be right beside you," I said. "Every step of the way. And Sarah, you're not alone anymore. You have neighbors who are willing to testify about what they witnessed. You have medical records that document your declining health over the years. You have me, and you have the truth. That's more powerful than anything they have." She leaned against my shoulder, and I held her like I used to when she was small. "Mom," she whispered. It was the first time she'd called me, that since the reunion. "I'm so sorry I forgot you." "You didn't forget me," I said, kissing her hair. "You survived the only way you could. And now we're going to make sure they can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt us." The Harper family's response to our legal offensive was predictable and desperate. They hired an expensive law firm and immediately filed countersuits. Defamation, emotional distress, alienation of affection. It was all noise designed to intimidate us, and Marcus dismissed it with barely concealed contempt. "They're flailing," he said. "Good. Scared opponents make mistakes." The first mistake came when Daniel showed up at my apartment building. The building manager called me immediately, and I called the police. By the time Daniel was escorted away, threatening to take back what was his, 3 neighbors had recorded the incident on their phones. That's violation of a protective order, Marcus said with satisfaction. And more evidence of his controlling behavior. Keep it coming, Daniel. But the real war began when Sarah and I returned to the mansion. We had a court order granting us access to retrieve Sarah's personal belongings, and we arrived with Marcus, a police escort, and a moving company. Daniel's entire family was there, lined up like they were defending a fortress. His mother stood on the front steps, her face twisted with rage. "You're not taking anything from this house," she hissed. "Everything in there belongs to us." "Actually," Marcus said pleasantly, producing documents, "the house and all original furnishings belong to Dr. Ward. Everything purchased with the Harper family's funds can be itemized and removed by you within 30 days. But Sarah's personal belongings, including everything from her childhood, belong to her." We walked past them, and I felt Sarah's hand tighten in mine. This was the first time she'd been back since our confrontation, and I could feel her fear. "You're safe," I whispered. "They can't touch you." Walking through that house was surreal. I saw how they'd redecorated, turning my carefully chosen furnishings into a gaudy display of wealth. But I also saw the small room tucked behind the kitchen where Sarah had been sleeping, a space barely bigger than a closet with a narrow cot and no personal touches. "This is where you slept?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sarah nodded, not meeting my eyes. "They said the bedrooms were for family only." The police officer with us looked sick. "Ma'am, I need to photograph this room for evidence." We gathered Sarah's things. Childhood photos they'd hidden in boxes in the attic, her clothes which were all worn and faded, the sketchbooks she'd been hiding. We found letters I'd sent, opened and read but never delivered, stuffed in a drawer in Daniel's mother's room like trophies. But we also found something else. Financial records, carelessly left in a home office, showing years of fraudulent transactions. Marcus nearly salivated when he saw them. "They've been stealing from the house's equity line," he said. "Taking out loans using a property they don't own." "Oh, this is beautiful. This is federal bank fraud on top of everything else." As we loaded the moving truck, Daniel's mother broke. She rushed at Sarah, screaming, "You ungrateful bitch. We gave you everything. We took you in when your criminal mother abandoned you. You were nothing without us." "I was nothing because of you," Sarah said quietly, and her voice didn't shake. "You took a grieving teenager and turned her into your slave. You stole her mother, her home, and her future. And you did it all for money and control. You loved Daniel," his mother shrieked. "You married him willingly. I was 20 years old, isolated, and convinced I had no one else in the world," Sarah replied. "That's not love. That's grooming. And now everyone is going to know exactly what you did." We left with everything that mattered, and behind us, I could hear Daniel's mother still screaming threats and curses. But they were empty sounds, the death throes of power that was already gone. The media attention started soon after. One of the neighbors who'd recorded Daniel's violation had posted it online, and suddenly our story was everywhere. Woman returns after 12 years to find daughter enslaved by in-laws. The headlines were sensational, but they weren't wrong. My phone rang constantly with interview requests. Marcus advised me to do one major interview and let that speak for itself. Sarah and I sat down with a respected journalist, and for 90 minutes, we told our story. Sarah spoke about the daily abuse, the psychological manipulation, the way they'd convinced her that her own memories were lies. I spoke about the framing, the 12 years of fighting to clear my name, the letters that had been returned. Together, we spoke about a system that had failed us and a family that had exploited that failure. When the interview aired, public opinion turned decisively in our favor. Daniel's business started losing contracts. His mother was confronted by former friends at her country club. They were being publicly shamed, and they hated it. But the legal battle was just beginning. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. I'd never seen so many people crammed into one space, journalists fighting for seats, supporters holding signs, the Harper family sitting on their side looking significantly less confident than they had weeks ago. Sarah sat beside me, wearing a simple blue dress I'd bought her. She looked terrified, and I held her hand throughout the proceedings, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Rodriguez, opened with devastating efficiency. She laid out the entire conspiracy, how Daniel's family had bribed my former colleague to frame me, how they'd manipulated a grieving teenager, how they'd committed fraud to steal property, how they'd exploited Sarah for years. This case, she said, looking directly at the jury, is about powerful people who believed they were above the law, who believed they could destroy one woman's career, steal another woman's freedom, and face no consequences. Today, we prove them wrong. The defense tried to paint Sarah as a willing participant, suggesting she'd enjoyed the security of living with Daniel's family. Their lawyer was sweating before he even finished his opening statement. Then came the evidence. Hours of it. The forged deed with the dead notary's seal. Financial records showing systematic theft. Video footage of Daniel's abuse. Testimony from neighbors describing years of Sarah's mistreatment. Medical records showing Sarah's declining health, her stress-related conditions that had developed during her time with the Harpers. Sarah testified on day 3. I watched her walk to the stand, so small and fragile-looking, and I worried she wouldn't be able to handle the pressure. But my daughter was stronger than either of us had known. She described her life in calm, clear detail. The 4 a.m. wake-ups. The verbal abuse. The way they'd intercepted every attempt I'd made to contact her. The way Daniel had isolated her from friends, convinced her she was worthless, controlled every aspect of her existence. "Did you want to marry Daniel Harper?" the prosecutor asked. "I thought I did," Sarah said softly. "But I was 20 years old, completely alone, and convinced that my mother had abandoned me because I wasn't worth staying for. Daniel's family presented themselves as my only option. They said they'd take care of me, that I'd be part of their family. I didn't understand until much later that take care of me meant use me as unpaid labor." The defense attorney tried to break her on cross-examination, suggesting she was lying, exaggerating, trying to steal property that didn't belong to her. "Your mother was convicted of fraud," he said smugly. "Why should we believe her daughter isn't equally dishonest?" "My mother was never convicted," Sarah said firmly. "She was framed by people connected to your clients, forced to leave the country, and spent 12 years fighting to clear her name. She succeeded. The only frauds in this courtroom are sitting at the defense table." The courtroom murmured with approval. The judge had to call for order. Then came the witness who changed everything. Dr. Raymond Price, the colleague who'd helped frame me 12 years ago, walked into the courtroom looking like a ghost. Marcus had found him, convinced him that testifying was his only chance to avoid becoming a co-defendant. "Did you participate in framing Dr. Elena Ward?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I falsified documents, created fake email trails, forged her signature on shipping manifests. The Harper family paid me $200,000 to destroy her career." "Why?" "Because she was investigating their medical supply company. She discovered they were selling substandard surgical equipment and falsifying safety certifications. If her investigation had continued, they would have lost everything. So they made sure she couldn't continue." The courtroom erupted. Daniel's father actually stood up, shouting that Price was lying, before being forced back into his seat by his own lawyer. After that, the trial was effectively over. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. We stood as they filed back in, and I felt Sarah trembling beside me. The 4 women stood. "On the charge of fraud related to property deed transfer, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of coercion and unlawful imprisonment, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud 12 years ago, we find the defendants guilty." The list went on. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each verdict was a nail in the coffin of the Harper family's freedom. Daniel's mother began screaming, having to be restrained by court officers. Daniel himself sat in stunned silence, his face pale. His father wept. The judge's sentencing was harsh. Years in federal prison for the adults involved.
Masi fines.
Full restitution to both Sarah and me for financial damages and emotional distress. Dissolution of Daniel's marriage to Sarah on grounds of fraud and coercion. As they were led away in handcuffs, Daniel's mother turned and screamed my name like a curse. But I just held my daughter and watched justice finally being served. 3 months after the trial, Sarah and I stood in front of the mansion together. It looked different already. We'd had the exterior painted, fixed the garden, removed every trace of the Harper family's presence. Ready to go inside? I asked. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. This time, she used her key, and she walked through the front door, not the servants' entrance. We spent that first day just walking through rooms, reclaiming spaces that had been stolen from us. Sarah chose a bedroom that faced the garden, with huge windows that let in morning light. We ordered furniture together, designing her space to be everything she wanted. The drafting table took pride of place by the window. Over the following weeks, we settled into a new rhythm. I'd been offered my position back at the hospital with a public apology and substantial compensation for the years I'd lost. I accepted, but on a reduced schedule.
My daughter needed me more than medicine did right now.
Sarah enrolled in online architecture courses, and I watched her bloom as she rediscovered her passion. Some nights, I'd find her still awake at 2 a.m., sketching and designing, making up for lost time. "Mom," she said one evening over dinner we'd cooked together, "I want to design a women's shelter. A place for people escaping abuse, where they can feel safe and start rebuilding their lives." "That's a beautiful idea," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "I want to name it after you," she continued. "After everything you fought through to save me. I want other people to have that same chance." We established the Sarah's Second Chance Fund with part of the settlement money, providing resources for women leaving abusive situations. The irony that it was funded with money taken from Sarah's abusers wasn't lost on anyone. The neighborhood welcomed us back with open arms. Mrs. Henderson became a regular visitor, and other neighbors stopped by with casseroles and kind words. The home that had been a prison became a sanctuary. 6 months after the trial, Sarah showed me her first completed architectural design. It was for a community center with spaces for art, education, and healing. "It's perfect," I said, looking at her detailed drawings. "It's a start," she corrected. "I have so many more ideas. Buildings that make people feel safe, that give them space to grow. Buildings that prove they matter." That night, we sat in the garden under string lights we'd hung together, and Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder. "I feel safe for the first time in years," she whispered. "Really safe. Like I can finally breathe." "You're safe," I promised. "And you always will be. I spent 12 years fighting to get back to you. Nothing will ever separate us again." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows as Sarah came down the stairs. Not at 4 a.m., not to cook for a family that despised her, but at 9 a.m., ready to work on her architecture homework, ready to build a future that was finally hers. She walked through the front door to get the mail, and I watched her stand in that doorway, framed by morning light, no longer a servant, but the owner of her own life. My daughter had been broken, but she'd healed. She'd been stolen, but she'd been returned. She'd been silenced, but she'd found her voice. And as I watched her smile at something in the garden, sketching it in the notebook she now carried everywhere, I knew we'd done more than survive. We'd won. We'd reclaimed everything they'd tried to take. And we'd built something beautiful from the ashes of what they'd destroyed. This was just the beginning of Sarah's second chance. And I would be there for every moment of it. If someone stole 12 years of your life and turned your child against you, how far would you go to get them back? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between mothers and daughters.